Hello, everyone. My name is Lauren Leidermann, and I am a historian of Jewish history here in Landkreis Görlitz. Eleni invited me to speak to you a little bit today about the history of Jewishness in music, starting from a broad perspective and getting a bit narrower into European influences from the 18th and 19th centuries up until the Third Reich and what the scene of Jewish music looks like today. So thank you so much for being here. I'm very excited to dive into this topic with you. So we're going to start with the history of Jewish music in Europe. The history of Jewish music in Europe is rich and diverse, spanning centuries, and reflecting the cultural, religious, and social experiences of Jewish communities across the continent. And in a brief overview, we can trace the evolution of Jewish music from its early roots up to the present day. We begin with number one, the ancient period. Jewish musical traditions have ancient roots dating all the way back to biblical times. And the Psalms, for example, were sung in the temple in Jerusalem, and music played very important roles in various religious ceremonies and throughout Jewish history. And they continue to today, which is pretty cool. In the Middle Ages, with the diaspora of Jewish communities from the Roman times, so the Jews were kicked out of Judea, or what is today Israel, and this created a very big diaspora which exists until this day. And Jewish communities particularly spread across Europe during this time. In Spain, under the Muslim rules of the Caliphate, Jews really flourished during this time period in arts and sciences and musics, and they really contributed to the development of Sephardic Jewish music, which is a very different type of texture of music than Ashkenazi music, which is what most people think about today when we think of Jewish music like klezmer. Sephardic Jews also migrated to other parts of Europe and had a great influence on the music of those regions, for example, the Balkans. I said this word Ashkenazi and Sephardi. So Sephardi Jews are those Jews who can trace their ancestry back to the diaspora in Spain, the Iberian Peninsula, so also Portugal. And Ashkenazi Jewish people are Jews who trace their ancestors in the diaspora to what is today Central Europe. And in also Eastern Europe, I should say, Central and Eastern Europe. So in Ashkenazi tradition, in Eastern Europe and Central Europe, the Ashkenazi music tradition developed distinctive musical styles that were completely different from Sephardic music styles. And one of these music styles that popped up was klezmer. We're going to talk about more about that later, but a basic definition of klezmer music is that it's characterized by lively dance tunes, often featuring violin or a clarinet, and it's still a prominent part of Ashkenazi tradition today. Klezmer musicians in the past and present are often hired to play at Jewish weddings and other celebrations such as bar mitzvahs. So going up from the Middle Ages and Jewish music coming to Europe, or Jewish people coming to Europe for that matter, we get to the Renaissance and Baroque. And Jewish composers and musicians were active during the Renaissance and Baroque periods. Salomone Rossi was an Italian Jewish composer, for example, and he integrated Jewish liturgical texts with contemporary Baroque music, creating a very unique fusion. So you can check him out. In the 19th century, moving on, we really witness a flourishing of Jewish music in Europe with Jewish composers like Felix Mendelssohn, more on him later. He was a very central figure in the Romantic era, and he gained prominence throughout all of mainstream music, in the mainstream music world, not just in Jewish circles. Synagogue music also evolved during this time with the development of the Reform movement of Judaism, which led to new musical expressions in worship. It's important to note that Jewishness or Judaism is on a spectrum, and there are very religious adherents to Judaism. There are Jews who consider themselves completely secular. My husband is a secular Jew. His ancestors were all Jewish. but he himself is not a very religious person, but nevertheless, he's Jewish. And there's also Reform, which is a bit more of a liberal expression of the religious sides of Judaism. And then you have Conservative, which is a bit right of center. It's not Orthodox, but it's also not so liberal as Reform Judaism. And in the 19th century, Reform Judaism developed some very beautiful hymn books and psalm books that can be sung. And we see examples of this, for example, in Görlitz. If you go into the synagogue, you can see in one of the exhibits one of these prayer books, which would have probably been written during this time period in the 1800s. Now, in the early 20th century, we also have a very big revival of klezmer music. And this was especially in Eastern and Central Europe, so let's say Hungary and Poland. And this is where musicians really sought to preserve and revitalize this very important Jewish genre. And today it's led to a very large global resurgence in its popularity. Now, the Holocaust, for Jewish musicians during the Holocaust and its aftermath, we're going to go a bit more into this a little bit later, but basically the Holocaust had a very profound impact on Jewish music, especially in Europe, as many musicians and composers were murdered during this time. However, we should also say that Jewish survivors of the Holocaust contributed to the post-war revival of Jewish cultural life with new compositions reflecting the resilience of the community, as well as the mourning of all of the family, friends, loved ones, and the loss that we experienced. And the last bit that I'll talk about in this general overview is the contemporary period, which is up to today, right? Jewish music in Europe, it still continues to evolve today. And traditional forms coexist with contemporary expressions, incorporating influences from various genres. Jewish communities celebrate their cultural heritage through music festivals, concerts, and educational initiatives. And we see that today, as sad as this is to bring up, on October the 7th, many of the Israelis who were murdered, the Jewish Israelis, were actually attending a music festival. So in this overview, we've touched on very key points in the history of Jewish music in Europe. It's very brief. We could go into this for hours and it would be a very good discussion, but we have more to get into. It is very important to note that this is a vast and dynamic field with a wealth of regional and individual variations. And the music definitely reflects the diverse experience of the individual Jewish communities as they adapted to changing social, cultural, and religious landscapes throughout history. So, like I said, the history of music in Jewish culture is rich and diverse, literally spanning thousands of years, influenced by a variety of geographical, cultural, religious factors. And I want to explore in the more broad sense what that looks like, these key moments and developments. So I said that we can really trace Jewish musical roots to the biblical times, and this is approximately 1000 BCE to 70 CE. And with these, the type of music that we found that historians have found from this time are the Psalms and cantations. And these are the very earliest forms of Jewish music that we can trace back to the Psalms. They were sung in Jerusalem in the temples. Cantillation is the chanting of sacred texts and is still sacred music tradition in Orthodox communities today. Now, the diaspora influence is from 70 CE up until 1492. And this was the Jewish communities were dispersed after the destruction of the Second Temple in Jerusalem in 70 CE. And as Jews settled in various regions, their music absorbed influences from their surrounding cultures. So again, I keep going back to this idea that Jewish music is a very flexible form of art because it takes in so many different influences depending on where these Jewish people settled. The Sephardi and Ashkenazi traditions, two major branches of Judaism culture emerged, each with distinct musical styles. Sephardic Jews, we must note, were expelled from Spain and Portugal in 1492 with the Spanish Inquisition. And when they were expelled, they did carry with them this rich musical heritage that they had gotten while for the hundreds of years that they lived on the Iberian Peninsula. And then on the other hand, we have the Central and Eastern European Jews, the Ashkenazi influence, which developed this really amazing tradition of klezmer. And klezmer incorporates elements of folk, dance, and classical music all together. And as I said earlier, this music is still popularly enjoyed today at concerts and for Jewish communities personally at weddings. That's what comes to mind, and at bar mitzvahs, times of joy. Now, when Central European and Eastern Jewish communities started immigrating to places like America, which is my home, they definitely brought this klezmer tradition with them to America. And in America, it even evolved more. It blended with jazz influences and other styles, and also influenced popular music in America today. And also in Israel, we can definitely hear elements of klezmer music, sometimes in pop music in Israel, for example. Now, from the Middle Ages up until today, we also need to talk about liturgical music. So the music that would have been sung in the synagogue, or is sung in the synagogue, because this is all present today. Nusach is the traditional system of Jewish prayer modes. Known as Nusach, it plays a central role in liturgical music, and different Jewish communities develop their own unique Nusach melodies for prayer services. Chazanat, or professional cantors, emerged to lead congregational singing during the 1800s and enhance the worship experience. Chazanut is characterized by intricate melodic ornamentation and expressive vocal techniques. And cantors in Jewish communities, they train a very long time to earn that position. I have a lot of friends who are currently serving as cantors in America and also in Israel, and it's very impressive, all of the study that they go to reach that position as a singer. So from the 20th century up until today, Jewish music, it continues to evolve, embracing all of the wide ranges of styles through its very diverse history of the Jewish people. And from classical compositions by Jewish composers like Lenny Bernstein to the popularization of Jewish rock, hip hop, electronic music, the diversity of Jewish musical expression reflects the global nature of how big the Jewish community actually is. It's a small group of people. It's a very small minority, but it's literally all over the world, and it's pretty cool in my opinion. And it also speaks to the creativity and the adaptability, excuse me, of Jewish musicians. And it's this adaptability that ensures that this musical heritage remains vibrant and relevant in the modern world. So going a bit more into a specific time period of Jewish influence on music history, I wanted to talk a little bit about the 18th and 19th centuries, specifically about important Jewish composers and poets from this time. So Jewish composers made significant contributions to classical music during the 18th and 19th century. And while they may not have been as numerous as widely recognized as some other composers of that time, several Jewish musicians played important roles in the development of classical music. One notable example is Felix Mendelssohn. We talked about him earlier. He lived from 1809 until 1847. And Felix was a German composer, and he was also a conductor, and he was of Jewish descent. Mendelssohn was a prominent figure in the Romantic era, and his works, such as the Overture to A Midsummer Night's Dream and his violin concerto, remain immensely popular today. I know you've probably heard them. And another noteworthy Jewish composer is Giacomo Meyerbeer, who lived from 1791 until 1864. Also a German composer, most primarily beloved for his operas. Meyerbeer was a key figure in the development of French grand opera and achieved really, really great success with his works like Les Huguenots and Les Prophètes. Le Prophète, sorry, my French, Le Prophète. And it's important to note that during this time, being Jewish sometimes presented challenges for individuals in various fields, including music. Anti-Semitism is a theme that goes throughout, that travels throughout history with the Jewish people. And many Jewish composers faced direct discrimination and obstacles, and their achievements were not always as widely acknowledged as those of their non-Jewish counterparts. But despite these challenges, some Jewish composers managed to leave a lasting impact on the classical music landscape of the 18th and 19th centuries. We talked about Felix Mendelssohn and Giacomo Meyerbeer, but we also have Jacques Offenbach, who was also born in Germany, but was a French composer of German Jewish descent, best known for his operettas, including Orpheus in the Underworld and one of my favorites, The Tales of Hoffmann. Any sopranos in the house here? Um, we also have Salomon Sulzer, who was an Austrian cantor, composer, and a huge contributor to the repertoire of music we have for prayers in the Reform branch of Judaism. He is particularly well known for his efforts to introduce more modern music into Jewish worship services. He lived from 1804 until 1890. We have Fanny Mendelssohn, who was the sister of Felix, and she was a highly talented composer and pianist. And she composed a significant body of work, including solo piano pieces, many lieder, and as well as chamber music. And so girl power. And one of the last musicians who I'm going to talk a little bit more about in a bit was Gustav Mahler. And Mahler was renowned as in the late Romantic period. He was an Austrian composer and conductor, and he was born in what is today the Czech Republic. I would say that his compositions are really well known for their emotional depth, their innovative orchestration, and expansive structures. I've talked a bit about composers, but we also had several poets who really left their mark on the world also during this time, and one of those was Heinrich Heine. And to talk a little bit more about him, because he's super important, not just for for general history, but also for his role as a poet with very deep with a very deep Jewish ancestry. So Heinrich Heine was born in 1797 on December 13th in Düsseldorf in what is today Western Germany. And he came from a Jewish family and received a traditional Jewish education, but he later converted to Christianity for social and career reasons. It's not that uncommon during this time period. A lot of Jewish people did this. He studied law at the universities of Bonn, Göttingen, and Berlin. And his early works were influenced by Romanticism, and his poetry often explored themes of love, nature, and the supernatural. His debut work, Die Gedichte, the poems, was published in 1891 and gained attention for its innovative style. But Heine's writing evolved to include political and social commentary. He became known for his sharp wit and satirical observations. And in 1823, he traveled to England, a journey that profoundly influenced his perspective on politics and society. His experiences abroad are reflected very much in his later works. It's important to note that Heine offered many critiques on German society. Heine's critical stance on German politics and society, particularly his satirical pieces, led to conflicts with the authorities. His major work during this period is Deutschland ein Wintermärchen, or Germany, a Winter's Tale, which was a satirical poem of the political situation in Germany at that time. In his later life, Heine settled in Paris, when this would have been around the 1830s, and he continued his prolific writing career here, producing poetry, essays, and travelogues. And it was during the 1840s that he suffered from various health issues, likely related to the early stages of paralysis that would eventually come to confine him to his bed. Heine is remembered for his lyric poetry, his innovative use of language, and insightful social and political commentary from the time. His works influenced later writers and thinkers, including Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels. And despite facing censorship and criticism during his lifetime, Heine's greatest writings have endured, and he is considered today to be truly one of the most outstanding German poets. Heinrich Heine died on February 17th, 1856 in Paris. And it's important to say that over time, his works continued to gain a broader recognition. And today in the schools here in Germany, he is celebrated as a key figure in German literature. Now, Heine's complex legacy encompasses both his contributions to literature and his engagement with the social and political and social issues of his time. His ability to blend wit, satire, and emotion in his poetry continues to resonate with readers today. And we could not have a lecture about important influences on the cultural scene of Europe without talking about, or important Jewish influences on the cultural scene of Europe without talking about Heinrich Heine. I also just shortly wanted to talk a little bit about Gustav Mahler because he is particularly one of my favorite composers because he composed so many beautiful vocal pieces for mezzo-soprano, which is my voice classification. So Mahler was born in 1860, as I said, in a part of Bohemia, which used to be the Czech Republic. He was a prominent figure in the late Romantic classical music and is particularly renowned for his symphonies. Mahler's early music career involved conducting in various opera houses in Europe and gaining experience and recognition. And he later became the director of the Vienna Court Opera in 1897, a position he held until 1907. Concurrently, he composed his most significant works, which were often met with mixed reviews during his lifetime. Mahler's compositions are known for their emotional intensity, their intricate his intricate orchestration, and an innovative use of large orchestras. His symphonies in particularly are considered monumental achievements and often reflect profound philosophical and existential themes. Notable among them are Symphony Number 1, the Titan Symphony, and Symphony Number 2, Resurrection, as well as Symphony Number 5. Throughout his life, Gustav Mahler faced personal challenges, including the death of his children and health issues, which he expressed through music and some of his lieder. And he passed away on May 18th, 1911, at the age of only 50 in Vienna. While he did not witness the widespread appreciation for his music during his lifetime, Mahler's works have since gained considerable acclaim, and he is now regarded as one of the most influential composers of the late 19th and early 20th centuries. So moving out of the 19th century, we're going to go into the 20th century, which was, man, such a time of change in Europe. We had 2 world wars. I'm up until today. Our ancestors of the 20th century really experienced a lot of life. And all of the big things happening around the world definitely had an impact on what Jewish composers were doing during this time. So Jewish music in the early 20th century up until World War II was a rich and diverse tapestry that truly reflected the cultural, social, and historical experiences of the Jewish communities around the world at this time. And in this brief overview, I'll touch on some of the key developments that happened within the time frame, let's say, of 1900 up until 1938. So again, we get back to klezmer music. Klezmer really gained popularity in the early 20th century. Again, this is that music that's characterized very lively, dance, played at weddings and bar mitzvahs. So we have a lot of klezmer music happening in Europe at this time, especially in the more Eastern countries and central countries. It is important to say that German Jews were really tried to distance themselves from klezmer and more folksy types of music. The bourgeoisie of Jewish communities, especially like in a city like Görlitz, for example, they would have much rather been associated with going to the symphony and listening to someone like Mahler or to more classical music with more classical roots. They tried to distance themselves from klezmer. It was too folksy for the bourgeoisie. We have the Yiddish theater, which pops up during this time. Yiddish, of course, is one of the languages within Ashkenazi Jewish cultures. Yiddish was not spoken in Germany very often by Jews. Like I said, the German Jews really tried to distance themselves from anything that was considered sort of folksy. And Yiddish is really a mix of languages that uses Hebrew spelling, so they do use the Hebrew alphabet. There's a lot of German influence, and in fact, in times that I've been in Jerusalem with my family, sometimes I think I will hear German, but it's not German, it's actually Yiddish. Yiddish was primarily spoken in Eastern European Jewish communities, however. But the Yiddish theater does pop up as a significant cultural phenomenon in the early 20th century, especially in New York City. And this is with composers like Abraham Goldfaden and Shalom Sekunda, who created music for Yiddish plays, blending together Jewishness with theatrical elements. Number three, we have cantorial music, going back to the synagogue. Synagogue music evolved with cancers, becoming influential figures, and traditional liturgical music was often infused with emotional and expressive interpretations during the early 20th century. We have some updates in Sephardic music. So Sephardic Jewish communities, and remember, Sephardic, these are the Jews who came from what was formerly or not formerly, who used to formerly live in the Iberian Peninsula. And these communities, the influence of it created a very, very cool, distinct musical tradition. And also with its own special language. So Yiddish was the special language of the Eastern European Jews, and Ladino is the very special language to these Sephardic Jewish communities. And it's totally a language. You can hear it spoken in Israel today. There's a very good series on Netflix called The Beauty Queen of Jerusalem, and you can hear it spoken in this, this television show. Can recommend it. It's a great TV show. And the Ladino music really incorporated themes from North Africa and from Spain and from the Middle East. And so Ladino music today is becoming very popular again, actually. It's really cool. Check it out. Composers and innovators like Ernst Bloch, Arnold Schoenberg, and Dmitri Shostakovich made significant contributions to classical music during this time, and their works often reflected the complex experiences that they were going through, especially politically during this time with someone like Shostakovich, what was happening in Russia during the early 19th century. As we know, there was a very big revolution. So Jewish folk and popular music encompassed a variety of styles reflecting the diversity of Jewish communities worldwide. A lot of popular Jewish songs in Yiddish and Hebrew address themes of love, migration, and cultural identity were popping up like daisies around this time. Now, we do have to say that the anti-Semitism created by the Third Reich definitely influenced what was happening here in Germany, starting in 1933 and really a bit before, because anti-Semitism didn't just pop up in 1933. As I said, it's something that has followed the Jewish people for as long as time. And sadly, from 1933 on, there is a loss of some of these pre-war musical traditions have been forever altered or lost because of the discrimination faced from the period of 1933 up until 1945. During the early 20th century, it's impossible to talk about Jewish art without talking about the migration and cultural exchange that was happening during this time. Jewish migration, especially to the United States, brought about a blending of musical styles. Jewish musicians often engaged with jazz, swing, and other popular genres, contributing to a really dynamic musical landscape that would eventually result in what is today Broadway. And there were so many composers during this time in America. One of the ones that first comes to my mind is Gershwin. Prominent Jewish background, whose legacy still lives on today with so many popular songs. So without the Jewish musical influence, we would have no Broadway, we would have no show tunes, Oscar and Hammerstein, all Jewish composers. And I just wanted to say that, despite the challenges faced by Jewish people during this period from 1900 up until about 1938, these very strong composers, very brave people, they really laid the foundation for the continued evolution of Jewish music into today. And a lot of artists, Jewish artists and composers still draw from they still draw inspiration from these historical roots that were laid from 1900 up until 1938. Now, we went up to 1938, so I want to take a little bit of time to do a focus on the period of fascism in Europe. What happened to these composers? Like I said, a lot of art was lost. Some that will never be able to, musical influences that will probably never be able to revive. It's very safe to say that this was a very tumultuous time in German history, marked by significant cultural, social, and cultural changes, political changes. And during the rise of the Nazi regime, the impact of these changes on Jewish music was profound. Before the Nazi era, Germany had a vibrant and diverse Jewish musical culture. Jewish composers, musicians, and performers were active in various genres, including classical, folk, and popular music. And some notable Jewish composers who emerged during this period included people, like I said earlier, Arnold Schoenberg, Kurt Weill, another favorite of mine, and Paul Hindemith. However, with the rise of Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party in the 1930s, anti-Semitic policies began to severely affect the Jewish population, including musicians and artists. The Nazis implemented various discriminatory laws reflecting the participation of Jews in cultural and professional spheres. Many Jewish musicians faced persecution, lost their positions, and were banned from performing. In 1938, during the infamous Kristallnacht pogrom, which is in English, that's what we call it. I know that it's in Germany, they say Reichspogromnacht, but in the English-speaking world, we still refer to it as the Kristallnacht pogrom, the Night of Broken Glass. Jewish-owned businesses, including music stores and music schools, were targeted and destroyed. Jewish musicians were further marginalized, and many sought to flee Germany in the face of increasing persecution. As World War II unfolded, the situations for Jews in Germany became increasingly dire. The systematic genocide of the Holocaust resulted in the mass murder of millions upon millions of Jews, including musicians and artists. And this tragic chapter in the history had a devastating impact on Jewish culture, including music. Some Jewish musicians did manage to escape and continue their careers in other countries, thus contributing to the cultural landscape of their new homes. However, the loss of talent and the disruption of a once thriving Jewish musical tradition in Germany were profound and irreversible. After World War II, efforts were made to rebuild Jewish cultural life in Germany, and the post-war period saw the emergence of new generations of Jewish artists, including musicians who sought to revive and continue the rich traditions that had been disrupted by the Nazi regime. And today we're still continuing this effort to document and to learn more about the contributions of those who were persecuted during the Holocaust. And going back to this choice, for many Jewish composers, this rise of Nazism in Germany and also in other countries, Austria, the Czech Republic, it resulted in a very, very difficult choice to make. Stay and submit to an unknown future in an increasingly hostile environment, or leave for a foreign land. Cut off from one's cultural heritage, cut off from your language. Not an easy decision to make. In hindsight, it would be easy for us to say, of course, get out, but imagine going somewhere where you don't speak the language. You're probably not going to be respected for your for what you're good at in your language, or what you're taught to do. And let's imagine that you're in your 40s. Not always so easy. And you love your home. That's another good point. In the early days of Nazism, when the choice was still not an obvious one, it was far from an easy decision. And shortly after Hitler seized power, Kurt Weill, he said, quote, "I consider what is going on here so sickening that I cannot imagine it lasting more than a couple of months. But one could be very wrong." End quote. Once the Nazis had passed laws cleansing Germany's cultural life of Jews, composers were forced for financial reasons, irrespective of their feelings or foreboding, to consider exile. They could not join the newly created Reich Musik Chamber. And while the rules in the first year of Hitler's regime were not rigorously enforced, royalties from compositions soon dried up. Many composers left for the United States, there to find employment in universities, on Broadway, or in Hollywood, while others, such as Egon Velitz and Bertold Goldschmidt, headed for Britain. Some of the most prominent Jewish composers of the 20th century were thus forced into a tremendous upheaval that had a lasting effect on their music. And among those who went to America were Arnold Schoenberg, Kurt Weill, and Erich Korngold, all prominent composers of vocal music. Other composers, such as Ernst Krenek and Paul Hindemith, were driven from Europe for reasons other than their racial identity. Schoenberg is perhaps the most well-known of this group of exiled composers. A converted Catholic, he nevertheless officially returned to the Jewish faith in 1933, shortly after his dismissal from the Akademie der Kunst in Berlin, where he had been teaching since 1925. Schoenberg was one of many composers, including Ernst Toch and Igor Stravinsky, who ended up in the warm climate of California. And like many others, he found it a bit difficult to adjust at first to a life outside of Europe. His music, which the Nazis had thought to be a sign of degeneracy and artistic Bolshevism that completed a process of musical ruin begun by Mahler, proved barely more popular in his adopted homeland until after the war, and he was forced to accept numerous teaching positions at California universities in addition to taking private pupils. He did, however, produce A Survivor from Warsaw in 1947, which was inspired by tales of courageous Jews singing on their way to the gas chambers. Schoenberg became a U.S. citizen in 1941 and remained in California until his death in 1951. In contrast to Schoenberg's relative reticence to engage with his new cultural surroundings, Kurt Weill positively embraced the new opportunities afforded to him by his exile, making a major contribution to American musical theater. The composer of the Three-Penny Opera, which was written in 1928, and The Rise and Fall of the City of Mahogany, which was composed from 1927 to 29. He had for a long time been a target of Nazi activists by the time the wave of arrests that accompanied the Reichstag fire in Berlin on the 27th of February, 1933. These things convinced him that he was in fact in danger. And following a period of time in France where he was at least relatively well known, he was drawn to the United States in 1935 to work on a visually spectacular pageant of Jewish history called The Eternal Road. By the time it finally premiered in 1937, Weill had resolved to leave his European past firmly behind and to try his hand at American musical theater. He scored most notable successes on Broadway with Knickerbocker Holiday, Lady in the Dark, and One Touch of Venus. And though he did not participate in any political way against Nazism, his musical contributions to the 1943 pageant We Will Never Die ensured that some knowledge of the Holocaust spread throughout America. Like Schoenberg, Weill became a U.S. citizen. He died in New York in 1950. Weill also attempted to gain employment in Hollywood, an important source of work for many exiled writers and orchestral musicians. But he could not accept the restrictions placed upon him by movie producers. However, for the Viennese former child prodigy Erich Korngold, this proved to be less of a problem. As a well-known composer on both sides of the Atlantic, his 1920 opera Die Tote Stadt had been a big success at New York's Metropolitan Opera. Korngold had flirted with Hollywood as early as 1934 at the invitation of fellow émigré Max Reinhardt. However, it was only in 1938 when work on the Errol Flynn Schwarzbuckler, The Adventures of Robin Hood, encouraged him to leave Austria, just as the Anschluss with Nazi Germany was taking place. He became a permanent exile in California. Korngold contributed hugely to the relatively new art of film scoring, and many more recent film composers, such as John Williams and Jerry Goldsmith, have acknowledged the debt they owe to Korngold's music. The sound of Old Vienna is still readily detectable in many of his scores. However, and the first score, written in, excuse me, lost my place with my lecture. And the first score written in exile was affectionately known by members of the Warner Brothers orchestras as Robin Hood in the Vienna Woods. Though he attempted to return to Austria after the war to resurrect his concert and opera career, Korngold was evidently more comfortable with the nostalgic image of pre-war Europe that his music often evokes. He remained in California. He too became a US citizen and died in 1957. It was not only Jewish composers, though, who were forced into exile. The Austrian Ernst Krenek was by Nazi definition of pure Aryan descent. Nevertheless, he was considered a cultural Bolshevist and was often branded a Jew by Nazi propaganda. As the composer of the 1927 jazz opera Johnny Spielt Auf, he warranted a place at the infamous Degenerate Art exhibit of 1938, which also had several display placards devoted to Kurt Weill. And when the Nazis annexed Austria, he immigrated to America, where he became a naturalized citizen. Similarly, the German composer Paul Hindemith was one who, as he put it, recklessly danced in front of the trap and ventured inside, quite by chance when I happened to be outside the trap closed. He was a prominent composer in the Neo-Baroque style of the 1920s, and a composer who paid particular attention to the political role of music. Many of Hindemith's works were banned by the Nazis for evincing features of cultural Bolshevism. And he also escaped to America. And I believe he was pretty satisfied in America that he felt that he was able to contribute to American cultural life through his music. So, Jewish composers during this time really went through a lot of hardship, and we can really tell how it shaped the music that they produced during and after this time. While composers like Schoenberg and Korngold and Toch really suffered from a large degree of homesickness, they were uprooted from their former lives. They were forced to abandon friends and family, many of whom died in the Holocaust. Many of these people considered themselves to be the fortunate ones. Schoenberg was one of these people who said that he was even though he was also a victim of the Holocaust, he would tell people that he was one of the fortunate ones. And he would very often talk about the gratitude for America, the land that gave him a new home. While many felt that their exile disturbed their careers to such an extent that they never recovered their reputation. For example, Toch believed himself the most forgotten composer of the 20th century. It's sad. More music of the early 20th century, branded degenerate by the Nazis, thankfully, is becoming better known. These voices, unlike countless millions of other Jewish voices, were not permanently silenced. So we get to the end of the war. What is the role of Jewish music from that point up until today? And it's challenging to cover all Jewish composers post-World War II up to the present in just about 10 minutes, but I can provide some overview of some notable figures and their contributions to classical, contemporary, and popular music. Keep in mind, this is not an exhaustive list, as there are many, many more talented Jewish composers than the ones I'm going to talk to you about. The first one that came to my mind from composers was Lenny Bernstein, who lived from 1918 until 1990. Bernstein was a very versatile American composer, conductor, and pianist. There is a famous movie about his life out right now. Haven't seen it? You have to tell me and Eleni if it's any good to watch. And it's impossible, I think, to live our lives without knowing a little bit of Bernstein. He wrote West Side Story. His compositions spanned from classical music, operas, Broadway, to film music, to orchestral works. Um, One of my personal favorite operas of his is A Quiet Place, which is actually semi-autobiographical about his own childhood with his parents. Number two, Steve Reich, who was born in 1936 and is still alive today. He is a very influential American composer associated with minimalism, and his notable works include music for 18 musicians and different trains. Number three, operatic composer Philip Glass, who was born in 1937. Philip Glass is another key figure in minimalism. Glass's works include operas, symphonies, as well as film scores. And his notable compositions include Einstein on the Beach, the film score for The Hours, and Philip Glass is a composer who is still actively composing, so who knows what we're going to hear from him in the future. Another iconic composer that I'm guaranteed that you've heard before, John Williams, who was born in 1932. John Williams is a prolific film composer, most beloved for writing the film scores for such blockbuster hits such as Star Wars, Indiana Jones, and Schindler's List. Number five, György Ligeti, who lived from 1923 to 2006. And he was born in Transylvania, came from a family of Jewish descent, and he was very well known for avant-garde compositions, including works such as Atmosphäre and Requiem. John Adams, an American composer for his minimalist and post-minimalist works. Notable pieces include Harmoniera and Nixon in China. And John Adams is also a composer who is still actively composing today. Osvaldo Golijov, who was born in 1960, is an Argentine-American composer known for blending classical, folk, and Jewish liturgical elements. And his notable works include the Dreams and Prayers of Isaac the Blind, as well as Azul. Esa-Pekka Salonen is a Finnish composer who was born in 1958. She's also a conductor and comes from a Jewish background. And he is known for his compositions and conducting, and he has worked with major orchestras worldwide. Michael Tilson Thomas, who was born in 1944, is an American conductor, composer, and pianist, and he served as the music director of the San Francisco Symphony and the New World Symphony. And last, Lera Auerbach, who was born in 1973. She is a Russian-American composer and pianist who is known for her symphonic works, chamber music, and ballet compositions. And once again, in addition to these composers, it's so important to recognize the diverse contributions of Jewish musicians across various genres, including popular music, jazz, and contemporary electronic music. The Jewish musical heritage remains rich, and it continues to evolve with the contributions of contemporary artists to this day. So, with that, I want to thank you for sitting through my lecture, and I hope you have a great rest of your day. L'chaim.